Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. And so today's capacity strengthening session is on this political economy analysis. And hopefully by the end of the session, you will know what we're talking about. So the first question is, why do we want to do political economy analysis? Why don't we just analyze the technical aspects of reform, whether they're financially sustainable, whether they're technically sound? Why do we want to focus on this kind of political side that it's always a bit sensitive? And we're not politicians, are we? So why don't we just steer away from that? But I'm very passionate about it. And I think without understanding the political aspects of reform, we're really blind to half of the, or maybe more than half of the reasons why reform happen or don't happen in a country or in a region. So the example here, it's of UHC. And as you know, UHC means that all people that have access to quality health services when they need it and without having to face financial hardship. Progress toward UHC means reducing fees and cost sharing and extending the population that are covered and include services that before were not covered. So this is that kind of a technical aspects. But importantly, there are multiple paths to get to UHC. There's not just one health financing reform or one health system reform that brings each country from where they are to universal health coverage, to reaching universal health coverage. It's not that simple, unfortunately. So what is UHC, as many of the health system reforms that we're thinking of? It's more of a normative vision. It's something that we aspire to in theory, but there are multiple ways of reaching it. And actually, it's more of a progress than a kind of an end point. So the fact that it's normative and there are multiple ways of reaching that means that it entails political choices that are made by politicians, but that are also made by technical people when they when they decide whether they want to go for one reform or another one. In the case of UHC, you can think, for example, the introduction of social health insurance, or maybe the extension of a free healthcare policy, or maybe thinking of some demand side option and trying to empower the demand, thinking of introducing community health workers. There are very different ways and very different reforms that we can implement, and they all entail a political choice, having to define which strategy we want for our country. So the fact that these reforms, all these health reforms, they entail political choices and make them a political subject. So we need to use that lens to understand them better. So the question is, we already kind of thought about it, but the question is, what is political in health? And let's get everyone in. Well, if you look, first of all, reforms represent a selection of values. If we think, maybe if we're more into a market approach, we want to kind of expand social health insurance, or maybe a private health insurance if we think that the private sector works better. If we think that there is a very strong social solidarity in the country, maybe we can strengthen and we can choose to strengthen cross-funding approaches, for example, increasing taxes earmarked to health. So every time we make a choice in health financing, but in the health sector in general, it entails some values, and values are by definition political. Also, reforms have distributional consequences. What that means, it means that every time a reform is enacted, some people will win, some groups of people will win, and some people will lose. For example, if you increase taxes, the richest, if it's an income tax, the richest might have to pay more, and so they will lose, and the poorest, they will benefit from that increase of taxes, if it's redistributed, for example, through the health system. So each reforms entails winners and losers, and so the representative or the interest group, they might fight to try and limit the losses or increase the wins. And I'm sure you can already start imagining that happening in your countries, and it happens on a daily basis on big reforms or small reforms. Also, reforms promote the competition among groups that seek to influence the distributional consequences. That's what we've seen, the interest group that try to block reform because they will lose out of them. They will lose financially, they might lose influence and power, they might lose their status or some other kind of type of resources that are available. And Sometimes the enactment or non-enactment of reforms is associated with events or political crisis. And this is a little bit the hypothesis of windows of opportunities. Health policy reforms are political because they can be spurred or sparkled by events in the political landscape. For example, if there is an election, that's kind of a classic example. Before or after the election, that's the time where reforms can happen because there is these events, they create maybe incentives or interest for certain group to push reforms or to block them. And finally, reforms can have consequences on the regime's political stability, on longevity. Sometimes a reform, even in the health sector, which is not considered sometimes that key for kind of political power, it might actually trigger some consequences for higher level political power. So for all these reasons, and I think you all starting to understand here what I mean, thinking of examples from your countries, health policy reforms are political. They're not just a technical exercise, they're not just a question of weighting the pros and cons or the technical aspects of that. It's really a dynamic process where different groups in power and not in power try to make sure that their own preferred option, given their power and their incentives, goes through and is approved and enacted, and those who are against their incentives and their interest is blocked. So UHC reforms are no exception, obviously, but usually they're health financing reforms and they entail critical distributional consequences. So progress toward UHC is a political process, which is shaped by the power relations between the individual or the groups or the organization, which we collectively call stakeholders. And I will introduce here some of the jargon of political economy, given a political, social, economic and security context. So here you can see already two key elements of political economy analysis. So the stakeholders, which is all the different actors that are involved, and the context. So usually we think of political economy it's about the interaction between the stakeholders and the context and how this produces political kind of outcomes. So in order to understand the progress or the lack of progress towards UHC, it's not sufficient to only focus on technical aspects, but we need to look at political elements. And this is why political economy analysis it's helpful. So I hope I convinced you that that usual argument, we're not politicians, we don't do this, it's not always valid, because in order to understand what is happening in each country, we need to understand better also these political dynamics, not only the technical sides of that. So then we come to the problem of, okay, then how do we do that? So there are different ways to explain how we do political economy analysis. And I think it's always, sometimes it depends also on the background of people, what have you studied? And obviously my background, it is on political sciences. So for me, it's quite obvious and a bit natural, but I think it's also something that you learn to do by just looking at the policy processes that are happening in your countries, and that you're kind of looking at the technical side and starting to think about the political side as well. And again, it's not rocket science, it's just something that we need collectively to be more explicit about. But in order to explain it a bit better, I think it's helpful to step back and think about, first of all, what are health policies and what is policy analysis, which is kind of like one step before doing political economy analysis. So the definition of health policies, of health reforms, is that there are decisions that are taken by those with a responsibility on a given policy area, in our case, health. And as I mentioned, policy is inextricably linked with politics. And in some languages, like in Italian and in French, politics and policies are actually the same word. So to say this link is really, really strong. But what does this mean in practice? So policymaking is the struggle between groups, as we said, with competing agendas, either in favor or against change, depending on their interest. So what are they winning or losing out of these reforms, and their ideas and values. The outcome of a policy struggle or of a policy process depends on the balance of power between the groups. So the groups who are more powerful, they usually win in this struggle of a policy decision making. between groups and individuals involved. And what is also important is to look at the rules that are established to resolve the tension between the groups. So that's something that we will discuss a little bit later, but there are some, what we call in political economy, we call them institutions. And these are the rules of a game and can be democratic rule of a game, or for lower level politics, it might be a technical working group where people meet together and make decisions. So it's always important to understand the process and the rules that are used to make these decisions. Are they top down or bottom up? How is the civil society consulted? That type of information is always important for us to understand how and why a decision is made in a certain way. So understanding policymaking processes requires unpacking the nature of power, how it is distributed, and how it is exercised. So we don't really want to focus on the what question, what is the policy about, so the technical aspect of that, but we want to understand who decided, why, and how. And this how is the policy process, so the rules of a game and the institution. And how do we do that? So if we look at kind of a more basic way of doing it is to apply some health policy analysis framework. So health policy analysis deals explicitly with the question of who influences the policy process and how and why. And there are many frameworks to do that. And here I'm presenting one that most of you might be familiar with, and we've used it, and it's quite helpful. It's very intuitive, but also very, very helpful. And it's the framework called the Policy Triangle by Walton Gilson in '94. So the triangle has 3 points, which include the content, which is more of a technical side of that, the objectives, the design, the implementation strategy of a policy. So if we want to do a policy analysis of a reform, for example, we try to understand what were the design feature, how it was implemented, when, and try to understand what were the implementation features, what changed compared to the design, and so on. So that's more like the content. And then we want to reflect about the context, which is the political, socio-economic, historical environment where the policy was, the decision was made and the policy was implemented. And again, it's really important to reflect on that. As I mentioned, election is always quite one immediate thought when you think about the context, but there might be others. If you look back in time, the historical linkages, for example, with colonialization and how it has shaped the environment where reform happened and in which way it has shaped it, that's important to reflect on. And so on, depending on what the events are. And again, for example, in our context, it might be conflict, it might be the political settlement, so how the conflict ended and what were the kind of societal agreement to make the conflict end, and how this has shaped the environment where the decisions are taken. And then the last point of a triangle is the process. So how the process of the adoption, the design, and the implementation of a policy, how it happened, who was involved, and also importantly, who was not involved. Did it happen, for example, at parliamentary level, or was a technical working group? How the civil society was involved, as I mentioned. So all these questions about the how are really important, because again, the how the process happens really influence what the decisions that are made. And finally, in the middle, at the core of a policy analysis, is the actors or stakeholders and their position, so their how they feel about the reform, their power, their interests, and their agendas. How they use their power, where their power comes from, and what are their what they want to do about the reform. Do they want to promote it, or promote only some aspects of it, or do they want to completely block it, and so on. So this is kind of a very useful, relatively simple, but very useful way of analyzing health policy and why it happens and how the decisions are made. Then if we want to take a step forward, already policy analysis is quite helpful to understand the political aspects of reform. But then if we want to take a step forward, we can try and do the proper full political economy analysis. So it's similar, but it's slightly more complex and entails some extra elements. The definition, according to a DFID document of 2009, is that political economy analysis bring together the economics of reform with the politics of change, but looking at how power and resources are redistributed and how interest, incentives, and institutions enable or hinder change. And such insights are important if we want to advance challenging agendas that do not lend themselves to technical solutions alone. So that's what we were saying about the why. And in terms of what is political economy analysis, again, this has this economic aspect. So really thinking about who's winning and who's losing and what are they winning financially or in terms of influence or in terms of control of resources, what are the wins and what are the losses. So if we think about that kind of economy aspect plus the political how, the process and the tension and how power is used. So that's what political economy does. And I have to say, again, to try and demystify the whole thing, political economy analysis or political economy is like very, very high level term. What it means in practice, it can be very different things as long as you're analyzing these high level concepts. And there are multiple approaches to do that in practice. Theories, frameworks, methods, and we will see some of them. So it's a little bit of a catch-all term that then once you understand what it is about, then you can use kind of as to fit what you're trying to do, what the research objectives are, and what the specific problem is. So, for example, you can look at one aspect. It's sometimes political economy analysis only focuses on stakeholder, and at least as a start, there is a stakeholder mapping. So trying to understand who are the stakeholder and what are the relative power and position and interest. And that could be the start of a political economy analysis. In other work, for example, the Overseas Development Institute have done quite a lot of work focusing only on the context and this what is called the political settlement. So how society and the kind of political elites are kept together. So what is the kind of high level agreement, for example, at the end of a conflict or a tension in the society that keeps together the country? Maybe it's a coalition, maybe it's a democracy, maybe some elites or some groups have been given some extra power or resources in order to keep quiet. So this, trying to understand how these political settlements define UHC, there's a literature on that, and it's quite interesting to see how only looking at the context, we have insights on how UHC policymaking is made. But sometimes you can also look at all of it, so the interaction between stakeholders and the context, and try to infer findings and reflections on that. And it can have different aims. Usually for us, we have a problem-driven aim in the sense that we're trying to understand why something happened or didn't happen or how we can make it happen. But in other cases, it can be more, even more practical, like an everyday political economy analysis, just trying to understand how the context change and the actors change every day, or more kind of a more kind of higher level political economy analysis, focus on just trying to understand rather than address a specific problem. So again, you can kind of pick and choose the different approaches depending on what your research questions are. And just to give you some examples, sorry, before giving you some examples, I'm going to just try and focus on some key concepts and a little bit again, talk about the jargon of political economy analysis. So we talked about stakeholders, which is a key element in any political economy analysis. And that means more or less the actors. It can be individual people, it can be group, it can be subgroup, it can be organizations. Sometimes we think, for example, of the Ministry of Health. But as you would know, Ministry of Health, sometimes it has different factions or different groups inside that. So it's important when we look at stakeholders to try and be specific about who they are and what their position and interest are specifically in relation to the reform. Then in political economy analysis, we talk about institution, and that's very tricky because when we talk about institution, we don't mean organization. And it's really hard at the beginning for people to understand that, but it's jargon. So don't be really thrown back by that. It's just the way of talking of political economists. But institutions mean the rules of a game. So just think of that each time. And it means how groups interact between themselves. So They can be formal rules like the laws or the political system, a democracy or other multi-party or one-party system, whatever is the case, and can be informal institution. These means the social and cultural norms. And when you ask political economists, they always make the example of tipping. The tipping is a social institution. There's nothing written about giving tips in each country or in each social setting, but in some setting it's the social norm, like you have to tip, and in others it's not. So, but it shapes how people interact, right? So that's a good example of an informal norm or informal institution. And then we think about the structure and the context. So the structure and the context are usually are a kind of the same as synonymous in the context of political economy analysis. So again, if there is a mention to the structure, don't be puzzled. It means just the context, and it can be the political or the social, economic, and institutional environment where the reforms take place. And then sometimes political economists talk about rents, and rents mean, in a sense, they mean incentive. It means what stakeholders are set to gain from a political reform, from a policy implementation. So these rents can be financial, so meaning financial gains, but it can also be increase in power or in influence or patronage. Do you know what it means? Patronage is when you have groups or individuals or groups that respond to your that are under your control. In DRC, I think it's called the umbrella system. So the people that you give favors to in exchange, for example, for electoral support. So that's called patronage. Values and beliefs is something that it's also mentioned in political economy. And again, it's kind of more like the deep intrinsic convictions of the people, and they might act as an incentive, even if it's not a financial incentive. It is an incentive to kind of push or block reforms and ideas. That's whole reflection about ideas and narratives and how shaping and framing concept in a certain way might push them forward or block them. So, for example, if you think about sexual and reproductive health, if you shape it and if you kind of frame the narrative as a narrative of women's empowerment, it might create blockages from some people who beliefs are against women's empowerment. But if you frame it as for example, maternal and child health or maternal health, then you might kind of overcome these challenges. And I'm very much simplifying here, but just to show you how ideas and narratives can be framed in different ways to gain or not support in relation to ideas and beliefs. So this is what we're really trying to analyze when we do political economy analysis and trying to think about how these elements interact between themselves. So these are some kind of like the words that are used, but once you understand what's behind each, I think that's quite intuitive to understand how they are influential in terms of defining the policy process. I'm going to skip these slides, but this is again kind of trying to summarize the different elements and their definition and how you can look at them. And we will share the slides so you can have a look at these later on. And this is to show you a little bit what the different political economy frameworks are. And again, it's just for you to have a list of them so you can pick and choose depending on what your interests are and what your research questions are. So there is a framework by Ashley Fox and Michael Reich from 2015 that looks at the 4 I's, which are interest, institutions, ideas, and ideologies. So again, you can see these concepts, how they come back again, and they're just organized differently in different frameworks. So they look at these 4 elements: the interest of a group, the institutions that I mentioned, the rules of a game, the kind of environment where decision-making happens. We call it also the process, the ideas, and the ideologies, so more like the values and the beliefs. And they look at them, at those 4 elements for each of a kind of stages of a policy cycle: agenda setting, design, adoption, and implementation of a policy. So again, if you want to analyze something retrospectively, a policy that has been adopted, designed, and adopted and implemented, you can look at these 4 elements, 4 I's, to try and understand how that process happened and why. Or, or you can use, this one. Or you can use this framework that focuses on 3 elements: the structural variables, which we said it's more like the context; the institutions, so the rules and the laws and the processes through which decision is made; and the actors and stakeholders. So focusing on these kind of 3 high-level elements, and then trying to understand how this influences policymaking. This one seems very complex, but in this case, it's only 2 elements that are looked at: the structural elements, so the context and the institution are brought together here, and then the agency, which means the actors. So here it's only 2 elements: the context and the actors, and again, how they interact together to define policymaking outcomes. So as you can see, everything is political economy analysis, but you can pick and choose which approach you want to use. And this is what we've been doing. For example, these 2 studies that I've done. On the first one, on the left-hand side, I only looked at context and institution and actors, power, incentives, and behavior, kind of in 2 separate categories, but then looking at the interaction. And in that second study, on the right-hand side, I also added in the blue box also this question of frames and framing, and how people talk about certain reforms, because that seemed to be important in that case. So again, to say this is really something, you know, that you can think about, and once you understand how you can use political economy analysis, then you can adapt it a little bit, and we will see that also from the case studies. So that's it from my side. I hope that wasn't too boring, and you have some references here, some of the work we've done, but also some more kind of key references that were presented in the presentations in terms of frameworks and different kind of how-to guides and things like that. And then 3 useful readings that I think they're very helpful. One by Lucy Gilson, this health policy analysis reader. If you want to have a look, that's not technically, it's not political economy analysis, but it does include a lot of reflections on that and is very, very helpful. There is also a recent beginner's guide to political economy analysis by the UK government, very, very helpful, kind of breaking down all the steps and the kind of different elements that you can use. And then this last document by the ODI, specifically on UHC and how looking at the political economy of UHC and the trends in 49 countries, so quite comparative in approach. So that's it from my side. And